Thank you for everybody to come to the privacy talks. Today I'm very honored to be invited Claire. She's expert in data statistics and policy making for the evidence-based approach. Today's topics about the US Census and her experiences. What is the issues? How we can make fair policy making through the social evidence. Thank you for coming, Claire, this time. So let me start the introduction of her. She's a lead data scientist of privacy and data security at the Auburn Institute. Her research focuses on the quality of differentially private data, census methods, and science communications. In 2016, she interned at the US Census Bureau, where she helped develop and evaluate differentially private data census methods for income data in the American Community Survey. Bowen holds a BS in mathematics and physics from Idaho State University and an MS and PhD in statistics from the University of Notre Dame. After completing her PhD, she worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where she investigated cosmic ray effects on supercomputers. She is also the recipient of the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship, the Microsoft Graduate Women's Fellowship, and the Gertrude M. Cox Scholarship, and was selected for the inaugural NSF Graduate Research Internship Programs and the NSF funded Rising Stars in Computational and Data Sciences programs. So it is very honored to be invited to Claire this time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So let's move to the interview agenda. I came across your background, which was very great to me because I used to work at the policymaking space based on some statistics or surveys from that. My first question is I'm wondering, why did you come to the data statistics and the analytics field from the experiences?
So I started in physics because I knew I liked science as a child, which is kind of like that dreamy stereotypical thing of like what do you want to be when you grow up, right? But as I was going through college, I really wanted to figure out how the world worked. So that's why I went to physics. But during my program, I realized that physics wasn't for me, and I also wasn't going to be a theoretician because I also went and got my bachelor's in mathematics and realized I wanted to be more applied. And so during some research programs and also just kind of figuring out what classes interested me most, I realized that I liked the statistics because there's this saying from John Tukey, who is a famous statistician, who said that with statistics, you get to play in everybody's sandbox. So I like the idea of being able to do all sorts of kind of science and mathematics, but different applications, but I can be a statistician for all of these different applications. So I went and pursued my master's and PhD in statistics. And during that time, I wasn't sure what my focus would be. I knew I liked research, but during some readings, my advisor said, well, maybe you want to check out data privacy. It was kind of random. And she said, well, that was my dissertation topic. I haven't worked on it since then. And so I read up on some articles and became interested and applied for some funding, and it just kind of snowballed from there. And so I did win some funding, which was great, so I could support my work, and I became more interested in this privacy field, specifically looking at the data releasing side of data privacy, where you're trying to balance the usefulness of the data while preserving the privacy of individuals when you're releasing a data publicly, which is really hard because these two sides are opposing each other naturally, because you can't have all the usefulness, like all the information from the data, and all the privacy protecting of the individuals in there. So that's a little tough. And I'm thinking we're going to get into that a little bit later because it's on your agenda. And so that's how I kind of got into data privacy. But getting into the policy space, it was a little different. I wasn't sure what I was going to be. I thought maybe I'll be a professor, but also during my graduate career, I realized that I did enjoy teaching, but I didn't want to go through the bureaucracy of academia in the United States. And so I did some internship programs, and that's how I got to Los Alamos National Lab, but I tried to expand out research-wise. So that's why it was very different than I normally did. But I found this job opportunity to work in a nonprofit, a public policies place, and here I am. I really enjoy my work. I love the fact that I'm making an impact with my research. So that's kind of the journey and story of where I am now.
Awesome. For me, that's we see that some parts of the statistics, from my understanding. For example, we have private companies is working on the many data, such as Google, the Facebook. They have their own statistics parts, but you are more close to the social or public space for the statistics. So in terms of this this role, so what is the difference? The private companies or public sector is the statistics level.
Oh, so the difference between the public and private space. Okay, so in nonprofit, we're, at least at where I'm working at, we are trying to create public goods. So whatever we produce, it is publicly available. So open source code, no paywalls behind any of our research and things like that. Whereas if you work in the private sector, they're going to be pretty more guarded about the research they developed. And it's usually for proprietary, what we call proprietary intellectual property on what they produce. So it's usually for something internal use, or if they do make it available for others to use, they usually charge a fee. Another thing is that sometimes the applications are different. So we work at our urban, we try to create, again, public goods. And so usually it's for a city who needs access to, trying to get their data accessed by other people, but protecting the privacy, at least in the context, again, for privacy purposes. We also work with federal agencies to try to help streamline their processes and stuff like that. So that's a big, major turning difference is the access and the fact that we don't charge.
I understand. Yeah, we sometimes get confused in the mixture of statistics. Sometimes the private companies is try to do the public good, but the problem is the purpose is a little bit different from experiences. Even the same laws, such as the taking a survey, the taking a statistics, but the private companies, the public good has a different landscape to go together. In the cases, maybe the data collection is a different parts of the completion than anything. So that's a kind of one paradox, I guess. So the next question is a very interesting one. So this year you have a very big campaigns in the US, there's the elections. We see some news from Japan, then you did the national census. That you are part of this research and developments. I'm wondering how this happens, any transitions since the US Census from the 2010 to 2020 this year. Maybe we have one decade since then. So what has been changed from that the 10 years ago?
So what has changed in the last 10 years? So you're correct that this year is kind of a unique year, other than the whole COVID issue, pandemic, global pandemic. We in the US have our presidential election happens to coincide with what we call the decennial census. So decennial meaning every 10 years we do a major count of the United States for every resident, someone who is living in the United States. So despite the controversy about citizen question, we count every single person who is currently living in the United States for the decennial census. This is very important because the count for the decennial dictates how the redistricting, which is a term for how we change the lines on where voting gets done. for the presidential or other kind of elections in the United States. So this whole confusing thing that you hear probably in Japan, the electoral college, like it determines how many electoral college votes get assigned to each of the states, which is a really big deal, right? Because California has over 50, whereas where I live in New Mexico, we only get 5. So it's a set number across the nation, and they just get reshuffled to each of the states and to each certain areas of within each of these states. And so this is why decennial is such a big deal. It also determines the, in US currency, a $1.5 trillion budget for the United States. So this is showing how important the decennial is. Now, what's the difference between 2010 and 2020 in terms of privacy? So through lots of history, which we're not going to go into, that could be a whole other kind of interview video talking about the history of the census. This US Census is required by law to protect the privacy of individuals that they collect. And when they publish the statistics, there has to be some sort of privacy guarantee to that. And also accuracy, of course, right? Because again, the census tells us how electoral college votes will be, and also that $1.5 trillion budget. But the issue between 2010 and 2020 is that technology has changed quite a bit. It's a lot harder to protect people's privacy. So the thing that I tell people is, well, imagine 10 years ago, the computers then are not as powerful as the ones that are living in our pockets. So the one I'm saying is our smartphones. So the average smartphone today is more powerful than the average computer, personal desktop from 10 years ago. So you can imagine that computing power that we have now, it's a lot easier to just kind of brute force figure out who are in public data sets. So that's the big change. And so because of that, Census is trying to make changes as well on how they protect privacy. And they've also did what they call a reconstruction attack against the 2010 data that was released, and they were able to identify quite a bit of the people in the data set. And so that was the alarming thing, which is why they're shifting to some of the changes for 2020.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, we still concede the same things in Japan, just making a more manual approach, such as any public staff doesn't open the door, please cooperate the examinations, and some people is rejected because the people is worried about the COVID-19. That's why the people don't want to disclose the open the communications. So yeah, sometimes the public staff is unknown, the people is not close to you. That's why they are very worried about whether she or he infected. In that cases, they don't want to take any time to give back their identity through that. So that's very interesting things. Yeah, the next topic is about your article. I was very inspired that you are very great experiences in your childhood, I guess. So you said in the former agenda as well that it's a very important to take an accuracies of census. Based on unprotected the privacy, the people is not open their identity to the statistics. So what do you think it's most of the critical issues without protecting the privacy for the census in this moment?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it goes into what I was trying to say in the article, which is most people think that the problem is easily solved or it's already been solved before, but it's not. Again, there's this balance between having information and privacy. And so the thing that I try to tell people over and over again is that you can't have both. It's impossible because they naturally polarize one another. The more information you learn about a person, the less privacy that they have. And so why is this problem really hard even for a large scale data set like one for the decennial, right? We're counting all the people in the United States, which is over 330 million is the estimate of all the individuals in the United States. So you think, oh, it's easy to hide someone in there. But let's say you live in a certain region of the US that's very rural, so then it makes it a lot harder. And I know that's sometimes harder for those who live outside of the United States. Like I have met people from the United Kingdom or in Japan to try to understand that there is a lot of empty space in the
Mm-hmm.
US, and there are people who live on large uh, space of a property where they don't see another person. And so when you're trying to what we call enumerate or count the people in the United States for the census, it's how you're going to protect that person who just lives in the middle of nowhere. They're pretty unique. Or even the fact that there are ethnicity or other kind of unique features that make it harder to protect somebody. So the example I gave in that blog was that if I was in the Washington, D.C. area, the District of Columbia, which is the capital of the United States, it's a very diverse
Mm-hmm.
population there. You get a lot of different people from different backgrounds and other demographics like age, gender, and so on and so forth. And so hiding someone like myself in that data is pretty easy. There's actually a good
Mm-hmm.
representation of Asian Americans there. But if you go back to where I grew up, I actually grew up in a very rural area of the United States. And so that area there isn't very much racial diversity. It's mostly Caucasian. And so to hide me in that area is very, very hard. And so most techniques to protect people, you either have to, again, you have to go back to that information accuracy privacy trade-off. Like, do you want
Mm-hmm.
full accuracy and say like there are at least one or a few people who have Asian descent in that area, but then you would fully expose those people, right? Which that could have some ethical issues. And then the other side being like, well, what if we just erase entirely and just say that there's only Caucasians in that area because that is the majority? Well, then there are certain things that could happen where you didn't take account of those people. So usually that use that data for economic purposes. Maybe they need to have better targeted programs because there's certain minorities who are more
Mm-hmm.
affected during downturns of like such as the current recession we're experiencing now. We're finding that those who are minority groups are affected more, or for health purposes. So actually in the central part of the United States, it's called the Midwest. It's not really the middle of the West, but
Mm-hmm.
it's called the Midwest of the United States. That's where a lot of our meat processing plants are. And many of the individuals who work there are of Hispanic descent. And so actually a lot of the warnings that was sent over there were actually targeted enough for those communities. And so they actually got hit pretty hard during the COVID, when COVID first came in the United States. And actually they're still being heavily affected
Mm-hmm.
to this day.
I see. So that kind of the issues will be reflected to the policy making anything for the state level.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this kind of the issues is direct to the reflect to the policy making? For example, like the minority people is the neglected any public services, public um, politic actions. So does it happen in any case before?
It can be. I can't think of anything specific because of the lack of the data, because normally people just say fully expose it for the public policy purposes, but people are becoming more and more aware
Mm-hmm.
of this privacy concern due to other things like Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook that came out in 2018 that kind of heightened some people's awareness. It got worse when there were some articles that came out then in 2019 and early 2020 about cell phone tracking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people are becoming more, like even more concerned. So this is all just in the last few years. So that now we're in 2020, people are concerned about contact tracing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the privacy of that. And then this is going to be leading on to, well, we're going to have these medical records, and we know historically that medical records of individuals like who have like unique infections or diseases like HIV or cancer,
Mm-hmm.
they actually suffer a lot of privacy loss and actually violations. And so you have to imagine that now that we're collecting all this rich data for COVID, that might be the same for those who get infected with COVID. So
I understand. Yeah, that's a very typical issues at this moment. From the your articles, I assume that you are trying to put the fair census is the very important to take a policy making for the future processes. So, what will be the requirements for the fair census in the future?
Oh, so fair census in the future. That's a really good question. I am not as much of an expert. I analyze a lot of census data, excuse me, and because of my privacy background, there's a
Mm,
lot of techniques that we can be shared from some census. But in general, what I can say about trying to ensure fair census is transparency is a very
mm,
important thing. Before, a lot of the older techniques, or at least for the privacy side, were kind of this whole, they kind of said what they did, but they couldn't reveal everything because they were afraid of people reverse engineering the methods. And so this is why some of the newer techniques that people are looking at is more transparent. They can actually say what the method is and maybe ways you can handle the alterations of the data without fully backtracking or reverse engineering, excuse me,
mhm,
to the original data. Other parts of fair census go into things beyond my expertise, which is what I was hinting at, which is there are other issues going on right now with our census that we've heard that from politically, the current administration has truncated the 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 collection of that data. So it started late because of COVID, but it got ended early. And there was also other political pressures. So those things should be removed for the next census, or at least if we want to be a fair one, because we should
mm,
have the full time to do the count needed to go across the United States, as well as not having the pressure of like these kind of additional questions such as citizenship status, because a fair census is one that you count every person who lives in the United States without fear that you're not a citizen. So
I see. So
mhm.
to achieve those transparent or more accountable processes to take in statistics, maybe we see that some of the technology, such as the differential privacies or any other kind of new technical solutions into the policy making. So do you think this kind of the technology could be useful for the practical policy making in the future?
So I am what I call a conservative optimist about differential privacy. It was
Mm,
my dissertation topic. And I think that it's the good step forward because it is more transparent. It helps us, what we say, quantify privacy without making certain assumptions of how somebody would attack the data, which is actually a drawback of past methods, is that you had to assume certain things were going to happen to the data, or somebody who was going to attack it was armed with certain information. And that was hard to predict. One of the reasons I'm a conservative optimist about differential privacy is that it's still a very young, what we call privacy definition. So
mm,
in itself, it's not a technique. It's a for a technique to satisfy differential privacy, we call that a differentially private technique or differentially private method. And so right now, again, it's still a young, very new privacy method. So we're still developing better methods that
mm,
satisfies differential privacy. And so we're not fully there yet. We still need to figure out good case studies on like more testing of data. So decennial census is technically a good test data, even though it's a very large one. It has what we call like very few questions. There's a lot of people you're counting, things like that. But I think with a lot of the other factors going on with the 2020 census, it's making it very hard to do it properly. So there's a lot of
mm,
controversy actually in the United States from people who use the census on whether or not this was the right route to go. So a lot of people are actually pushing back, saying that we shouldn't have applied a differentially private technique on the 2020 census, given certain things going on. So it's interesting. And part of that goes into something that I think is really important for both, not just to advance the privacy field, but also in the
mm,
public policy space, is better communication. Because right now, not everybody can be an expert, right? Nobody should actually know detailed understanding of differential
mm,
privacy or so the methods around it, but we should be able to communicate it better. And we're seeing that there's a huge disjoint between the scientists who develop these methods and the
mm,
policymakers who are going to make these decisions. And so this is going to be a very key thing. And I think I said that in my blog, that that's
mm,
something we need to focus on more than we did have in the past, is just how do we communicate these complex ideas to those who are
mm.
going to make these policy decisions.
I understand. Yeah, that's very insightful with me because I used to work in a political field before just a few years. But the problem is we sometimes it's been hidden the part of the society which is very challenging for us. sometimes we are just quoting some evidence that means just kind of the data. But the problem is we just seeing the data. It's not the people living in the society. That's a big problem. So we have to identify the who is the out of the scope that you were discussing at this moment, how we can be inclusive in the parts. It's kind of our challenging situation to serve your story. That's very good. So lastly, I would like to ask you to give any message from the experiences to the listeners. Some people is working on the policy making, the evidence base. So it's very helpful that you disclose your tips that you have the experiences of.
So my message is going back to what I just said before, which is education and communication. I think that is something that is not emphasized enough, at least in the United States, when going through any kind of scientific program. Many of them do not emphasize how important it is to be able to communicate to your audience about your ideas or what things need to be done and changed. So it's a little frustrating because in the past, I think, and well, I say the past, but it's also currently done in a lot of programs, that it's like, oh, as long as you do good science, that's all that matters. And it's like, well, no, it's actually, no matter how good the science is, if you cannot communicate it to those who need to understand it, then it's worthless. So that's definitely the message I want people to understand, is that be a better communicator and figure out how you can educate the public about what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great message. Thank you. That's yeah, I involves the educational field, and that's the requirements, especially like elementary schools, they need to junior high schools are taking these things to be to like learning, active learning for that. Yeah, that's a very great message. Yeah, thank you for coming in today. It's a very appreciated.
Again, thank you for having me, and I'm glad that we got to chat about my work and things that I'm
Sure.
passionate about. So yeah.
Oh, thank you.